Welcome back everyone to yet another lesson in the Python short course. Today in lesson 6, we'll be working with Python loops. Now, loops, otherwise known as iteration, can be one of the trickiest parts for any beginners in programming. However, today we'll do a couple of basic examples in our practical demonstration, and I hope it's going to make a lot more sense. Wonderful. Now with that being said, let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. As we've done before with multiple definitions throughout this course, we'll start off by defining Python loops. Then we'll wrap the lesson up with yet another practical demonstration. Let's start off by defining what loops are. We often use the term iteration and loops interchangeably in programming. In programming, iteration refers to the repetition of a statement or instruction or even a block of code over and over and over again until some sort of condition is no longer satisfied. We'll see an example of this in action when we proceed with the practical demonstration. Now in programming, there are various types of loops. The first and the most basic one is the for loop, and the for loop iterates within a given range. Next is the while loop. The while loop continues until some sort of condition is no longer satisfied. And lastly, there is the nested loop. Loops within loops within loops. For the sake of this course, we are not going to experiment or play around with the nested loop because this one can be quite intimidating. For the time being, however, I think it's important that you have a good understanding of the for and the while loop. Let us briefly take a moment to look at the architecture of a while loop. Usually we initialize the loop when we start with the loop. We then test for some sort of condition. If this condition continues to be true, we then loop through the body or the statement or the block of code associated with our loop. We then test this condition again, and if this condition is true, we keep looping over and over and over through the body of the loop until eventually the loop is false, at which point we exit the loop. Now here is a basic example of a for loop. In the first line of code, we initialize the counter, which is I, and I equals 0. So we essentially start the counter at 0. We then specify the for keyword as well as the counter, which is I. Next, we move on to say in range 10. The range function here basically means that the loop will continue to loop over and over until I is at least 9. And that is because the range function excludes the specified number. In this case, that is 10. And then we print hello world. Hello world continues to print over and over and over at least 9 times before the loop is exited. And this is an example of a while loop. The architecture is somewhat similar, however, the protocol is slightly different. Once again, we specify the counter and set this equal to 0. The counter in this case is I once again. We then call while I is equal to or less than 10, keep printing hello world. We then have to make sure that at some point we want to exit the loop. And that is where I equals I plus 1 comes in. What we've done is effectively incremented I, which is 0, by 1 unit, and we continue to do this until I is equal to 10, at which point the loop is exited. Now, if all of this discussion about loops and counters and iterations and satisfying conditions does not yet make sense, rest assured, after this practical demo, it's more likely to make a lot more sense. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. So, I am back here in PyCharm where I've created the lesson 6 folder structure. And what we'll do is we'll start off with a very basic for loop. And this is going to look very similar to what we actually just saw a couple of minutes ago. So I'll first start off by specifying my counter, which is going to be equal to 0. And then I'll start off with the for keyword and I'll say for I in the range function where 10 is my upper limit. Notice that with for loops and while loops, they are very similar in that we have to use indentation, much like we did with conditionals as well as functions. So that's why I'm specifying a colon over here so that on my next line I can indent. And then I'll say print the string hello world. So if I run this, hello world should print 9 times because remember we are excluding 10 from the actual range. So let's run our code and there we go. We can actually see that hello world has been printed out 9 times. And this happens because I is no longer within the range. Therefore, the condition becomes unsatisfied, so the loop stops. We can actually change this up and track our count over here. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. What I'll do is, instead of printing hello world, I'll simply print this is loop, and I'll concatenate this with a string conversion of I. So all we are doing here is we are tracking I at every iteration of the loop. So I'll clear this up, run this code, and you'll notice that we've printed from 0 to 9. Once this condition is no longer satisfied, the loop is then exited. Great. So what about while loops? Let's do an example of a basic while loop. I'll maintain my counter where I is equal to 0, and I'll start off by saying while I is less than or equal to 10, keep looping by printing this is loop, and we'll do another string conversion over here. We will track our counter. Now, what's extremely important here is that to make sure that we do not satisfy this condition at some point, we have to make sure that we are incrementing I. And to do that, we can use a simple one-liner where we'll say I is equal to I plus I, or plus 1. So at every iteration of the loop, I will always add 1 until this condition is no longer satisfied and I is equal to 10 and the loop is exited. So let's run this code. Let's first clear our console, run the code, and there we go. You'll notice that we've printed from 0 to 10. Now, the other interesting thing that we can actually try is to decrement instead of increment, because you'll notice we've gone from 0 to 10. But what if we wanted to go from 10 to 0? Well, that's entirely possible. And this is called decrementing instead of incrementing. So what I'll do is I'll refactor my code and I'll change I to equal 10. I'll then change the operator over here to say that while I is greater or equal to 0, because remember we are essentially reversing our algorithm, print the statement, keep it as it was, and then specify, or with every iteration of the loop, I is equal to I minus 1. Let's run our code and see what we get. Let's first clear our console once again. And you'll notice that we've gone from 10 down to 0. And that is basically how iteration works. Once again, you can try this in your sandbox environment or your cloud environment if you prefer not to work in PyCharm. In today's lesson, we learned how to perform a basic loop. We've learned how to perform a simple while loop. We've also learned how to print statements out as we loop through our algorithm. And we've learned the basics of iteration overall. In our next lesson, we're going to cover Python modules. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.